welcome back to English Champion. Haven't done one of these for a while. I do appreciate, as I said previously, that so many of you visited during the summer to hear some of my shorter podcasts, but I did want to get back and take a deeper dive into an important topic that I've been wanting to discuss for a long time, and thought finally now is the time to do it. I just realized I said deeper dive. I really hate when people say deeper dive. The only thing maybe I dislike more is when people say unpack. Let's unpack that. That's really annoying to me. So I'm gonna try to not use those cliched phrases when I can. I might have to do an entire podcast at some point about all the trendy, slangy phrases in culture right now that I get annoyed by, because that list is long. So we are going to take a deep dive, but we'll use a different phrase. We'll say we're going to explore very thoroughly this important topic. And that topic is critical thinking. I think we are at a critical thinking crisis point in our culture that has only been exacerbated in the last, especially 3 years, but probably 10 years or even more. And it's permeated throughout the culture. It's not just in education. It has become prevalent in all areas of our social and political and cultural lives. So the idea of critical thinking has been a buzzword, especially in academic circles, for a very long time. For as long as I've been a teacher, over 20 years, that's been the real push, is to constantly put in your materials and in your lesson plans and in your presentations, everything has to be about critical thinking. And it's never very clear what exactly that is. And too often it says, at our school, we really emphasize critical thinking. And then someone says, well, how are you doing that? What is that exactly? And they say, well, we really train our students to think critically. Like, you're just going in circles. What do you mean by critical thinking? And so I'm going to go into some of that here. Again, not only from an education standpoint, but from a broader cultural standpoint for the next little while. Now, over the last couple years, we've really seen this critical thinking problem emerge, most specifically through the COVID problem. We've seen it through some of the racial or gender issues that have come to the forefront. Anything nowadays having to do with the government or policies is basically demonstrating this critical thinking problem. And what's happening is, for each of these issues, the general view or the general process is you kind of just go along with it. Whoever's in charge, you're not really allowed to question it. If you do question it, you're going to get punished. Even if something seems specious or illogical, you're not allowed to offer alternatives. So these are all tied with critical thinking, because anything that blocks or hinders our ability to explore alternatives and find different types of solutions and explanations, this is all an attack on critical thinking. And for a culture that's already struggling with it in the first place, to be, like I said, hindered or dampened in that way by powerful people is making everything even worse. So again, we've seen it in those political arenas. We've seen it in the replication crisis in science going on right now, especially in the social sciences. There's been a lot of evidence that shows many of these studies and research projects emerging lately are written with purposeful bias and the lack of rigor in the experimentation. People are basically reaching predetermined conclusions, which is the complete opposite of science. We're seeing it in journalism, where journalists are unwilling or somehow unable to uncover facts that might be something they don't agree with. They're not challenging those in authority to prove why they're doing what they're doing. They're more often just aligning with their own powerful interests when they should be challenging those and looking at things from different perspectives. That's their job, is to hold powerful people accountable and approach these complicated ideas from a variety of angles, so that we are, not harming each other. And journalists today are much more falling in line with a kind of a propagandist kind of practice than anything that would be traditional journalism that requires deeper thinking. And of course, all of media is like this, everything from the news channels we watch to the websites you click on to the social media platforms you participate in. Everything is designed to reinforce existing interests rather than allow us to challenge those thoughts and come up with alternative ideas and form hypotheses that we can investigate. Everything is a giant echo chamber, as so many other people have talked about for the last 5 to 10 years. So, all of these areas of our current culture are just making our ability to think critically even worse. And critical thinking is partly about challenging your own assumptions that you might not be right. You might not have all the information. And that's the basis of science as well as journalism, that everything should be up for debate. Everything should be allowing further investigation so that we can ultimately find real truth and reality that we can live by. So there's all sorts of problems going on in our culture. And at the root of many of those problems is this bigger idea of critical thinking. And again, this is it's coming from the field of education, and it just keeps expanding outward, I think. So, the question is, how do we get there? How do we get better at this? How do we teach young people better so that when they go into these fields of science or journalism or politics or anything else where they're influencing the culture, they can do better? And when I think of critical thinking and how we've been led astray, I think back to a novel I teach on certain occasions in some classes, the novel Hard Times by Charles Dickens. And Dickens' novel it's a very easy read. It's a really enjoyable book. But in the first few pages of that novel, there's a character called Mr. Gradgrind, the perfect Dickensian name, Gradgrind. And he's a schoolmaster, and he enters one of his classrooms, and he is admonishing his students to make sure, and his teachers for how they're teaching, that they should be teaching only the facts, no imagination, because some of the kids are drawing pictures and they're coming up with poems and doing these beautiful imaginative things. And he says, no, only the facts. That's all we teach here. And so Dickens and his fellow romantics of the 19th century, pushing imagination and creativity and feeling, this was one of the key components of the Romantic era. And so we understand why they're doing it, but not, in a contrarian way of thinking about this, Gradgrind isn't wrong here exactly. He's not necessarily a bad guy in the novel, but he's not the villain, but he is certainly meant to be mocked. He's not the role model that we should be following, according to Dickens. But actually, he's more right than we want to admit. We actually do need to be starting with the facts. Imagination is great, creativity is great, but actually you have to have knowledge first. You can't think critically about things you don't know anything about. And so that's what we're going to go into a little bit here, is this notion in academia that's, again, been in place for several decades, actually, which is we've got to get kids to think, to be imaginative and to explore and all this stuff. It's like, yeah, except if they don't even know what they're looking at, they can't do that anyway. So we need to start somewhere. There's in the education world, there's a lot of memes that go around, and they're intended to appear to be very profound. And oftentimes this is why technology and meme culture and things on the internet are so incomplete and lack depth, is because we can take these quotes from famous people or smart people and say, aha, here's this grand idea that solves everything. And you see a lot from people like Einstein, and one of his quotes that he said, apparently, was that imagination is more important than knowledge. So here's an example of lack of critical thinking for people who use that quote, because that quote is actually taken out of context from what Einstein was saying and what he actually meant. The idea that imagination is more important than knowledge is ridiculous, okay? You have to have knowledge in order to have imagination, or at least to have the imagination that you have be able to be useful in some way. If you listen to 3-year-olds tell stories, go ask a 3-year-old, hey, tell me a story off the top of your head. They will tell you the most imaginative, creative, insane story you have ever heard. You can't imagine how they even came up with that. Okay. They're so ridiculous. Sometimes they're scary. Like, why would you even think of something like that? But it's because they're just thinking the most random thoughts off the top of their head. And you know what? They're being imaginative. But what they're describing has no basis in reality, and you can't implement any of those ideas in the real world. So, yeah, they're being creative, but it's not to a very useful end. And so when we say, well, imagination is really important, well, no one would say that that 3-year-old is smart because they can tell you an absolutely fantastical, ridiculous story that really makes no sense. That's not intelligence. Real imagination, as Einstein was actually referring to, is once you have this very strong foundation of knowledge, that you've acquired all these facts and these concrete ideas about the world, then you can start to hypothesize about alternatives, and you can approach these complicated ideas from a variety of different angles. But again, if you don't have the background knowledge, you wouldn't even know how to start being creative or employing your imagination, because it wouldn't be rooted in any reality. So again, when we take these quick, clever quips by these smart people and say, aha, here's how we should be doing, in this case, education. It's like, well, it's a lot more than that. You can't just form an educational philosophy around a half-conceived, out-of-context quote by an otherwise brilliant person. There's another one that goes around that says, education is not the learning of facts, but the training of the mind to think. And again, you think, okay, sort of. Yes, it's the training of the mind to think, but you can't train a mind to think unless it has some background knowledge to think about. And I'll talk about that more here in a second. So again, this is the problem with pulling these quotes from famous people. The people who do that aren't actually critically thinking about the quotes they're using as their own reference. So we have to do better when we explain our philosophies and why we believe these things about learning or about education or about knowledge, because there's more to it than these pithy quotes. So this is why I'm such a big proponent of educational philosophers like E.D. Hirsch and other knowledge-based scholars, is because not only do they advocate some of these social and cultural benefits of knowledge-based learning, but this is also what allows for critical thinking. Again, you can't critical think unless you have knowledge already. Teachers are constantly describing how saying they're working on critical thinking with their students, but they also they don't want to be the teachers that are drilling facts. And so that means they aren't actually doing critical thinking. Again, there's been the push in the last couple decades that, we don't want to drill and kill in this classroom. We don't want to just spend time spouting facts. It's like, yeah, but you have to have facts first. Otherwise you can't analyze anything. It's as if we, I used to teach 5th grade. And so years and years and years ago. So, I would teach the American Revolution. U.S. history was part of 5th grade. And that's like saying we're going to do critical thinking about the American Revolution, but the kids don't know anything about when it occurred, who was involved, where it happened, what were the causes of why it happened. You can never get to any sort of elevated level on Bloom's taxonomy, such as, applying or comparing, contrasting, or definitely not evaluating, unless you have the background factual knowledge. So, if you're going to analyze, you have to know what you're analyzing. So this is what the problem is in current education with critical thinking is we say we're doing it, but then the very thing that would help us do it, we kind of avoid. And that means you're actually not doing critical thinking. So let me give you just a quick, silly, practical example about what I mean when it comes to being able to analyze something more deeply. I was, in my earlier years, I was a basketball coach, both at the high school and the college level. And being a coach requires strategizing. You have to anticipate what your opponent's going to do. You have to be able to analyze your own team so that you can put them in the right positions to be successful. You have to design things. You have to, because you're designing plays and strategies, you have to communicate in ways that are fairly complicated if you're doing it correctly. You have to have all sorts of techniques for understanding the game of basketball and then teaching it to young people if you're going to actually be a basketball coach. Only lots of knowledge, years of knowledge and experience that I had and that other coaches have, can lead to the ability to critically think about coaching. So again, the if we're using Bloom's taxonomy as sort of a model here, and I'm not saying that that's perfect or that those are all the best descriptions of the levels, but you can understand how there is a foundation and you have to work up. You have to have a certain set of knowledge before you can rise in the comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, evaluation pattern. You can't do any of that without knowledge. So here's a point of to contrast it with. I don't know, though I know a lot about basketball, I don't know anything about the sport of cricket. Nothing. I know they have interesting bats they hold, and the guy who throws the ball, he throws it kind of weird, as it's different than baseball. I know they wear big, strange pads on themselves, but I have no idea how you score. I have no idea what the rules are. I have no idea who the best players or the best coaches have been. I don't know anything about the history of the game. I know nothing about how that game operates. So if you asked me, hey, let's do some critical thinking about the sport of cricket, develop a strategy that you would use against the other cricket team, I wouldn't have any clue what you're even talking about because I don't know the basic facts about that field of study, about cricket. So again, I know a lot about basketball, so I can go through all the levels of critical thinking with that. I don't know anything. I would be stuck at the basic knowledge level. I don't even have comprehension. I'm below that when it comes to cricket. So there's no way I can work up the hierarchy towards true critical thinking if I don't have the foundation of knowledge. So that's where we are with so many people in our culture, but particularly young people. They just don't have enough knowledge, and our teachers aren't spending enough time instilling that knowledge so that they can then develop the alternative thinking skills that would make them much smarter. So one thing I talk about in my classes is, it's difficult to be a human being because we're subjective beings that live in an objective world. And so we have to kind of recognize some of our limitations. That doesn't mean we become relativists or all-out subjectivists. What our goal is that we use our perception and we use what we have to make the best of it, as far as understanding truth and reality. But we also have to know that we're limited and we have to seek out some alternative ways of discovering those truths and realities. So what I do in my classes is, to demonstrate this fact, I often do a colorblind test up on the screen. And I show the students those big circles with all the little dots in them that are different colors that have numbers hidden in them. And I go and I go through the pictures and I ask the students, okay, can you see this one? Can you see this one? And I tell them that I can't see hardly any of those. My whole life, I've never been able to. I remember when I was in kindergarten, we had to take some eye tests and stuff, and I couldn't see any of the circles. And so they called my parents like, hey, do you know your son is colorblind? Now, I'm not actually colorblind. I have no problem seeing color. But in those tests, I can't see them. I don't know why. Even though I'm middle-aged, I have perfect vision. Otherwise, I don't have glasses, contacts. I don't have any vision problems. I just can't see the colors or the dots in those tests for whatever reason. And so in my subjective view of the world, when I look at those circles, it's just a scattered batch of circles. I don't see any number in the circle. My students all see it, or I'll have one or two who are like me and they can't see it either. But the 30 other students, they see it just fine. So we have this conflict of, well, what's real? What's true here? Well, what I instruct my students to do is say, okay, so this demonstrates that I don't have all the knowledge of the world just within me. So it's up to me to go find out from other people, from books, from wherever, that there's more information that I need to gather so that I can get a greater understanding of reality and the real world. So then I can go through the world. So, this is what leads us to, whether we, in school, whether we're doing research or just trying to learn other topics, you have to go find out stuff from other people because their subjective experience in the world could allow us the ability to understand reality that we don't currently have. And so again, if I were to be limited in my critical thinking, I would look at those circles and those dots and I would say, oh, they're just circles and dots. There's nothing there. But a good critical thinker might go to some other people and say, hey, this appears to me like there's only circles and dots here. Do you see anything else? Am I missing something? Is there something I should know about? And they say, oh yeah, there's a number 37 hidden in there. And then I go, oh, okay, great. Now I know that there's another aspect of reality that I wasn't aware of before. And now I can decide what I want to do with that information. But if I'm going to close myself off and go, nope, nothing to see here. Nope, there's no other data, no other evidence, no other truth out there. I know everything already. Well, then you're not critically thinking. So this is just one simple way in my classes that I demonstrate this idea that we need to go deeper. You don't know everything. So if we're going to critically think, one way to critically think is to go seek out more information so that we can build our knowledge base so that we can then go through the steps of higher order thinking. So this is also why the trendy notion in academia right now is not just academia, in the world of law and other political avenues as well, the idea of lived experience. Well, your lived experience, there's a truth there. Well, yeah, it's true in that something happened to you, and it's true that you have an interpretation of the world. That's mostly true. But again, you don't have all the access to reality. There are other truths that you're missing out on because you're only relying on one way of achieving that truth, your own lived experience. You can't say that lived experience is an ultimate truth. Even the phrase, "Oh, you gotta live your truth." That's a really bad phrase because it's not true. It's your interpretation of the truth. But again, the truth is way bigger than that. And there's more information that's needed so that we can understand reality. And your lived experience is not encompassing of reality. So what often this leads to is you're just using these arguments of whether it's lived experience or even something like, we'll just follow the science when you aren't following the science. You're just using that to win an argument. But that's not the point of critical thinking. Critical thinking is intended to help us function in the future. It's to help us act appropriately according to whatever circumstances we find ourselves in. Critical thinking is not about being right at this moment. It helps us become more accurate in this moment, yes, but ultimately it's to help us improve for the future. So too much of what goes on in our current culture, whether it's in academia or in politics or journalism or anywhere else, is everyone's so focused on winning an argument right now that you're not looking at the bigger picture, that we have to go through these higher order thinking processes so that we're better prepared for any future problems that might arise. Because if we think we know everything right now, we're always going to be susceptible to something changing in the future that could get us in trouble. So critical thinking is so important for, again, not only living right now, but it builds our character and it builds our understanding of reality so we can go forward in our own lives and in our lives in conjunction with other people. This idea of understanding other perspectives and realizing I don't have all the answers. It's really helpful. I talk about this in class too, that when you're in an argument with your friend, or someday for my students, when you're in a potential argument with your spouse, the way you can work on this, the way you can solve some of these problems is by, again, admitting you don't know everything, And so I'm going to try to learn what this other person that I supposedly care about, what their perspective is. And what you do is they tell you what what problem they're having with you, why they're mad at you, and you say, okay, so let me get this straight. You're upset with me because XYZ, and you feel that way because XYZ, and you'd like me to do this, right? XYZ. And if they say yes to all of that, then okay, you now understand what someone else is feeling and thinking that maybe you didn't realize before. You didn't realize you had upset that person. You didn't realize that you had offended them or done something that really bothered them. Well, now you know it, and they agree that you know it, and now together the two of you can work toward building a stronger relationship of understanding each other and solving that immediate problem, not only for the present, but also for your future, so that you don't run into this problem again. And if you do, you'll already have a way of solving it. You have a method now to go through to understand each other, critically think about the problem, and, not break up over it or not lose a friend over it. So you have to admit that one of you may be wrong, you both might be wrong, you both might even be right. You just see things differently. But you have to be able to share your version, your interpretation of the scenario, and then see if you can update, kind of like a computer. Like you're running on an old system. You have to update your system with this new information so that you can function more efficiently going forward. And, again, this helps socially with our personal relationships, but also this has broader cultural ramifications, because this is part of the reason our culture is so fractured right now. One thing that is really causing a problem with this, again, growing lack of critical thinking, is we just don't read enough. And so this is something I talk about with my students all the time. Reading is so important because it allows us to share ideas across space and time. I can still have a conversation with something Abraham Lincoln wrote, or something James Madison wrote, or Charles Dickens wrote. I don't have to be in the room face to face with that person. I can learn from these people across continents, across centuries. And when I'm learning from them, and again, getting other people's perspectives outside of my own, I not only become smarter, I become kind of a more human person. I can start to feel things that other people feel as well. And when you read, you are constantly summarizing and contextualizing. That's how you retain what you're taking in, whether it's a book or some article that someone wrote. Your brain has to summarize, put things in your own words, and contextualize. Basically, compare it to what else that person has said, or compare it to what you've heard other people say. And that's how you retain the knowledge, which then again allows you to use that knowledge for critical thinking. So prior knowledge, you usually have to have prior knowledge to understand the reading you're doing right now. But then as you build that knowledge while reading, you then become even smarter, which leads to critical thinking. So there's a very powerful circular process that happens there. And when you read, you develop your vocabulary, you strengthen some concepts that maybe before you'd only vaguely heard of. And you learn these terms that are the key to knowledge, which again is at the base of Bloom's taxonomy. So once you have that foundation of knowledge that you acquire from reading really good material, you can start to work upwards through the hierarchy. We also, when we read, again, what teachers should be teaching is that you read in context. You don't just pick out evidence that suits your goal. Again, it's not about winning an argument right this minute. Because when you do that, you'll always find what you're looking for, but that's not really the whole story. And sadly, this is what happens a lot in my field of literary criticism, why my field has become so corrupt and why I work so hard to try to change it, is because you read anything in the cultural vein of literary criticism, whether it's Marxism, feminism, post-colonialism, any of those, you'll always find interpretations and criticism that is taken out of context, and it's just done to prove a point. It's just done to make an argument that you already agree with. whether or not it's true or accurate or not doesn't really matter. You're just saying, aha, look, I found this thing that proves something I already thought about the world. So, you know, I win the argument. That's really what too many literary critics do. And that's really bad reading. And so, I try to help my students not do that, where you just pick and choose. You have to read in context. And, along with literary criticism, this is why literature is so valuable anyway, is it helps you build empathy and understanding others' point of view. And again, helping you understand that you don't know everything. Other people have information that you could learn from. And so, literature helps us with tons of critical thinking ability. And then in writing, once you read, then you go to write. Again, when you write, you practice summarizing. You practice interpreting other people's ideas in a fair way so that you can understand them and then maybe apply them to your own life, and you can analyze them more deeply. You can evaluate whether they're moral or not, or appropriate or not. You can go through all the levels of critical thinking after you've acquired the basics of the reading and writing process. So super, super valuable, and why English is so important for developing these critical thinking skills. Just more broadly, while I'm talking about education in my classrooms, something that really annoys me about what goes on in education today and the culture broadly is we use these cliches. And one of the more popular ones that gets brought up, especially in political discussions, is the education, not indoctrination cliche. And, that's a really kind of murky phrase, because there's always indoctrination. Everything you pick and choose to teach a child comes with whatever value system you believe is important, whether you're the teacher or the parent or a coach or a Sunday school teacher, whatever kind of teacher you are, where you're trying to impart knowledge and wisdom for young people. The fact that you're presenting certain things anyway shows that you've selected things for them to learn. So there's already a level of indoctrination. And usually that's okay. Well, not usually, but often that's okay, because again, you care about that kid. And so you're going to pass on that knowledge that you think is valuable because you want the best for that young person. And of course, this happens at, kind of religious institutions most predominantly, because you're trying to pass on values that you think are important, for not only the child, but for their family and for the culture in general. And so, you do believe there is a right way to go through the learning process. And so when we just say, well, no indoctrination, it's like, well, it depends on what exactly you're indoctrinating. Because if you're doing it with a specific worldview for a specific purpose, with a specific moral and value structure, then, people are going to do that already. The question becomes, well, what value structure is that exactly? And that's where you have to be careful. But even more about the values is you're trying to clarify truth. So if your values are really twisted and you think, well, I need to teach these young people these values because they're really important, but they're not based in any sort of truth, well, that's the problem. That's where critical thinking has definitely taken a back seat to your own ideological agenda. So there's always going to be some level of indoctrination, even if we don't like that word. The question is, what are you indoctrinating students with? Is it truth? Is it things based on reality? Is it things based on moral virtues? Because, most people are at least at some level okay with that. Now, what you can still do, and this is where the critical thinking comes in, you can still, even if you're presenting a specific worldview to young people, you can still offer the opposing ideas and say, here's what some people believe. Let's examine why they think that. We might not agree with that, but let's explore that and see if we can understand that point of view. That is what critical thinking is done, even in an environment where some level of what quote unquote indoctrination might occur. You can still do critical thinking in that environment, and that is what all teachers should be doing. Again, that can occur in a public school environment, private school environment. Presenting other views and exploring them, even if the purpose is to eventually criticize them, at least we need to help other people understand that these are ideas that exist in the world. And so we need to know those so that if we encounter them, we know how to handle them. Another cliche besides the education, not indoctrination one that we just need to be more specific about is the old, we want to teach how to think, not what to think. And again, this goes back to what I was saying earlier, which is, yeah, that's true. You need to teach them how to think. That's the critical thinking part. But again, you can't teach someone how to think about something if they don't know what it is you're even talking about. Like I talked about with cricket. You can't teach me how to think about cricket until I even know what cricket is as a sport. So at some level, you're going to have to teach students what to think. Now, those should be the basic facts of whatever it is you're talking about. And then you work upwards through the hierarchy. But to just say, well, I'm not going to teach you what to think. Well, of course you are. You have to, because otherwise students don't know anything. Your job as the teacher is to, at some level, teach them what to think. Like I said, if I was to teach my little ones years ago about the American Revolution, I have to teach them what to think about it before I ever teach them how to analyze what occurred and what alternative procedures or actions could have been taken. You have to know the facts first. So this is happening in a huge way at the high school and university level because so many students today have such low levels of background knowledge that when we bring these cliches to them and say, I'm here to teach you how to think, not what to think, you simply can't do that because the students don't know anything about what to think yet. And so they have to learn that. And then you can go to the how process, which is where true critical thinking lies. I think that one of the problems with any level of education, but especially high school and college, where the teachers are supposed to be quite intelligent, is I simply believe that most teachers today are not smart enough to bring out true critical thinking in their students. A really good teacher always has to have alternative views at the ready to challenge students. So as an example, I do this in my own classrooms with religion or politics or anything that has kind of multiple controversial views. If a student says, here's what I think is going on, here's what I think is right, here's my reason, I almost always take the opposing side, even if I actually agree with them. I take the opposing side to say, well, what about this though? What do you think about this? Here's something you're not realizing about that idea though. I constantly kind of poke and push the students to consider other views because that's how they're able to strengthen their own view. So my job as teacher is to make them think about things from different angles, not to change their mind, not to get them to think like I think. Most of the time my students have no idea what I actually believe about certain things. And that's good. That's what I want. I want to be the person that forces them to think critically. And the way we do that is we organize the facts so that we at least know what we're talking about. And then I push on application, I push on analysis and synthesis and evaluation and these higher level ideas so that by the end of it, those students have clarified what they actually believe. And then I go, great. Okay. That sounds like you know what you're talking about. Awesome. But until they do that, those students don't really have a foundation for the truth that they are trying to work with. And so that I think is what not enough teachers do. They either don't do it, they don't push and challenge students in that way, or like I said, they just don't know how. They're not smart enough to actually think about things from a variety of angles. And for anyone who's going to become a teacher, if you're a college student and you're thinking of becoming a teacher, you have to ask yourself, am I smart enough to do this? Do I know enough about tough topics, whether it's in history or in math even, that you think is very straightforward? Well, there's all sorts of ways we can challenge our thinking in these topics. You have to be really, really smart, because you being smart And a really, really good critical thinker is the only way that you can then teach your students to become smart and critical thinkers. So, it's becoming increasingly difficult. And part of that is due to teachers. The other part of it is due to the broader culture's over-reliance on simply having so much access to information, predominantly through the internet. We no longer really store knowledge in our brains very well anymore because we just think, oh, well, it's all online. I'll just look it up whenever I need it. In my classes, I use Nicholas Carr's very famous book, The Shallows, and his articles that he also writes to talk about this. And so what his research shows is that when people use the internet to simply look stuff up all the time and therefore don't retain any knowledge, background information, facts, etc., in their own minds, what happens is they actually don't remember it. Right after they look it up and they look at the answer, they immediately forget. And so if you're going to forget, that means you don't have knowledge, which means you can't comprehend, which means you can't work your way up through the critical thinking process. So it's becoming way worse because of technology. And so, we're not able to reflect on the knowledge that we require because it doesn't stick in our brains. We don't ruminate on it. We don't, do some self-evaluation and really ponder and think about things for any length of time because we've become a culture where it's like, oh, I need to know something. Let me Google it. Oh, there's the answer. Done. And then it escapes our brain again. So he has research on this, and it's a bit scary because this is now how all knowledge is transmitted. And this is really the only style or format that young people are accustomed to anymore. They literally don't believe they have to store information in their head anymore. They just hold it in their computer and in the internet. That's their just giant storage device. And they just kind of wander through life assuming they'll always just be able to look up whatever information they need. And again, that can work to a certain degree if all you need is, sort of frivolous, simple pieces of data. But on anything complex, if you don't know a lot about it already, well, you're never going to be able to critically think about it. So you have to be able to store information in your head. You have to have a knowledge base. Otherwise, you'll never be able to get to levels of critical thinking. That's just the truth of it. And our culture, particularly our teachers, need to do a better job of dealing with this problem because it's only going to get worse. So let me tie all this up. I always think when I think of critical thinking, I immediately always think of John Stuart Mill's book On Liberty, and where he famously said, I think it's probably in chapter 2. All the best stuff from that book is in chapter 2, where he said essentially you don't really have the right to believe in anything unless you can adequately argue the opposing side of that belief. So in other words, if you have, whether it's a political belief, a religious belief, anything you think you believe in strongly, he would say, and I had another teacher years ago say the exact same thing. He said, you actually don't have the right to even believe that until you can argue the other side just as well. You quite literally don't know what you're talking about. So this is what critical thinking is intended to do. It's intended to, like I said earlier, show us that we don't know everything about the world and reality. And so therefore we need to keep investigating and challenging those ideas and looking at ideas that might even contradict what we hold dearly. And then after we've done that, we still hold to those ideas. Great. That's what makes you who you are. That's your character. That's your value system. That's your belief. But if you can't understand the other side, then you kind of haven't done the mental labor to earn the right to hold those beliefs. And that's something I certainly believe in in accordance with Mill, and I try to emphasize in my classrooms. That's how I work on critical thinking with my students. Again, back out to a cultural standpoint and why we as social groups tend to argue and fight with each other so much. Jonathan Haidt's research and others as well, but his became kind of most famous in the last 10 years or so. He's shown in his studies that those on the left side of the political spectrum are the least knowledgeable about other political positions. So, both sides have problems taking each other's views. No one's perfect, but he says those on the left are the worst at it. Moderates and conservatives actually do better at understanding the left's views, their positions, than the left does about those in the center or on the right. So again, back to Mill, if you don't understand the other side, that means you probably don't even understand your own side that well. And if you don't understand your own side, you're just going to defend it without any real, without any deep thinking or good evidence or without ever being challenged. So you have to be able to know the other side. And the more you know about the other side, the better you can argue your side. And then, hopefully you can also get along with people to form compromises and solve real problems. So, the lack of critical thinking skills isn't just in the classroom or at the high schools or universities. This is out in the culture, and it's part of what's causing us so many problems. Let me end with this. A historian I really like, Jerry Muller, wrote in one of his books about Matthew Arnold. He was talking about that famous 19th century philosopher and author. He said, Arnold believed the public intellectual should show disinterestedness, meaning one ought to be able to get enough distance from his own view in order to criticize it when required. Living by ideas, he wrote, is when one side of a question has long had your earnest support, when all your feelings are engaged, when you hear all around you no language but one, when your party talks this language like a steam engine and can imagine no other. But to still be able to think, still to be irresistibly carried, if so it be, by the current of thought to the opposite side of the question. So as I said, when you're living in the echo chamber, when all you hear and all you see are people who are just spouting things back to you that you already agree with, if you can still, in the face of all of that, go, you know what? Let me take a look at this other side. Let me see if I can understand it. That is what he calls truly living by ideas, truly being disinterested, meaning, you kind of take a neutral position until you've genuinely made up your mind by examining all sides. He says that's what our intellectual culture should be today. That's what our scientists, that's what our journalists, that's what, our political philosophers, people who talk about important moral, civic ideas. That's what these people should be doing. And yet too often we just get entrenched in our own side. We don't think about other sides. We don't analyze deeply enough. We don't evaluate deeply enough. And that means you're not truly a deep thinker. So Muller adds at the end of that passage, the role of the intellectual for Arnold was to embody and encourage that quality of mind that allowed individuals to get some distance from their social, political, and economic milieu, to reflect critically, and to be carried away by truth. So wouldn't it be great if our culture could do more of that? Thanks for listening. See you next time.